Thank you for joining us. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot.
לעסוק בדברי תורה.
Thank you. Yes, exactly. All right. So we, I want to mention that initially, because we're sort of doing this in between things, from year to year, that we started the section that we just finished with the induction of Aaron and his sons and the offerings they brought. And I went back and looked at the offerings they brought. They had to bring a bull as a sin offering and two rams. One ram was an olah, was a whole offering, and that I've mentioned is to try and atone for for positive commandments that were not performed. And then the second ram was the one we were talking about over the last couple of days, which was the ram of inauguration, which was there to commission them, so to speak, to become priests and to the priesthood. And that's what we've discussed. And this whole idea of purifying oneself before taking on positions of leadership where presumably you're engaged in purifying others. So that's one of the major messages that we get out of this. Going on now. So v'zeh, and this asher ta'aseh al mizbeach, and this is what you shall perform on the mizbeach, is the altar. Vasim b'nei shana shnayim leyom tamid, as a perpetual tamid, as a perpetual offering, two shnaim, two lambs of a year, two yearling lambs a day, per day, forever. And it's interesting because this particular mitzvah is to be found later on in the book of Numbers in Parshat Pinchas, in the chapter that deals with all the statutory offerings. So just to tell you tangentially, there were two basic classes of offerings. One were mandatory statutory offerings that had to be brought at specific occasions. They represented the community. And then there were also personal offerings that were circumstantial. They would be brought depending on circumstances. So this is a statutory offering. Going on, there's no Rashi on this. Et hakeves ha'echad ta'aseh v'boker. The one lamb you shall do in the morning, you shall perform in the morning. V'takeves hasheni, and the second lamb ta'aseh bein ha'arbaim, you shall perform bein ha'arbaim in the evening. This is not at nightfall, I want to be clear. And this corresponds today, because we no longer have a temple, that is the shacharit service, the morning service that we perform, specifically that part of the service that we call the Amidah, the silent devotion, the standing prayer, corresponds to the Lamb in the morning. And at mincha time, the again, that particular part of the service corresponds to this Bein Ha'arbayim, right? In other words, towards evening, towards the word Erev actually comes from a word that means mixture. And here we're talking about mixture of darkness and light. And once the sun has passed zenith and is about half an hour after passing zenith, uh, the light starts to dissipate and darkness starts to occur. Of course, very little to begin with. And so that is the time period of the mincha service. So there are times when the shacharit, in other words, there's a starting time and an end time in which one can fulfill the obligation to the commandment to daven shacharit. And likewise with mincha, there's a specific time when you can daven mincha at the earliest point, essentially 12:30 local time, and local time has to do with the position of the sun. The time that we use in our watches is mean time, and it's not local time. I won't go into the very details, but it is the mean. In other words, you take a certain area and you divide it by through the middle, and you say that that time will apply to all those times in between these two particular points along a line of latitude. So this is based on something called rabbinic time, which is based again on local time. It gets a little more complicated, but I'm not going to go into that right this moment. The point, though, is that this idea that we're reading right here, that a lamb is to be brought in the morning and a lamb is to be brought in the afternoon, this was the priest's responsibility, is something that we have preserved all the way through this day. Bart,
How does this all tie in with Miller time?
ah,
So, so thanks for explaining that, because when I look at the halakhic calendar, it always shows those earliest times and mean times and all those aspects, and I never understood what they meant until you just explained that. So
oh,
thank you very much.
Is that also where Greenwich Mean Time comes in?
yes, it does. Yes, it does. That's the term of mean. Just like we know that in statistics, the mean is the point exactly between the two extremes. That's
That's
exactly
the
what it
median,
is.
actually.
Say that again.
That's the median.
I think maybe it's also called the mean.
Well, I was a math. We could take this offline. I don't need to study
Right.
it.
No, so okay. You did statistics. I did not study. I studied math, but not mathematical statistics. So okay. But that's how, at least that's what the mean means here, okay? At least in terms of timekeeping, because you realize that the time has to do with the Earth's position relative to the sun in terms of its rotation.
Well,
So,
here's a little clue.
okay.
The average person, or the mean person, has one testicle.
Oh dear. Now that's being recorded, you realize.
I realize that.
All right. So I'm not going to try and pull all these strands together and connect the dots to create Miller time for you, I'm afraid. But let's hope if Miller time means enjoyment, let's hope that that's what this is and satisfaction. Because there is, once you start to understand the prayers and their significance and the beauty of them and the amount of wisdom and skill that went into creating these prayers, including, of course, the whole idea of them representing these lambs, it starts to be something of that becomes extremely enjoyable in a very profound kind of way. Having said that, let me say that the lamb, remember, represents Jacob. That's who the lamb represents. And because Jacob is also called Israel, right? He has that name Israel. All the Jewish people subsequently have a connection to Jacob. And that's possibly why it was a lamb that was brought in the morning and a lamb in the evening. There's other symbolisms involved in terms of lambs as opposed to bulls, as opposed to rams, that is also included in these ideas. But to know that these animals represent the patriarchs. Going on. The next verse. The Isaron solet and a tenth part of fine flour, 10 measures of fine flour, balul b'shemen, okay, mixed up with oil, katit b'shemen katit. Shemen katit means pounded. So the process of extracting oil from olives, the purest oil would take place when they would pound the olives and just the very first bit of pounding and that tiny bit of oil that would get extracted was the purest of oil. And what happened was they were able to extract a lot more oil from the olives by a process of grinding and filtration. But even with the finest filter, there'd be some sediment involved in the oil. However, this initial act of extracting oil from the olive through pounding it would give you the least amount of sediment, and that's what it's talking about. But Rashi's going to explain that even though this appears as a mitzvah, that is to say, as a commandment, that the oil that is used in this with this meal offering, mixed with the meal offering, is still, it doesn't have to be. But I'm anticipating Rashi, and we'll take a look at him in a moment. Going on, just to finish the verse. Reva ha'in, a quarter of a hin. I put here, by the way, the measurements, the biblical measurements here. And so here we have a revi'it, right? And the reason it's called a revi'it is comes from the word four. And uh, so it's a quarter of a log, one fourth of a log. right? And here we go. So here we have the actual measurement nowadays in of what a revi'it is, about 76, so what, 7.6 cubic centimeters, I guess, or 2.7 fluid ounces. So these are these measurements here. So a quarter of a hin, nesach, a libation, revi'it ha'in. Okay, so v'nesach revi'it ha'in yayin. And wine, forgive me, wine as a libation, again, a quarter of a hin. So a quarter of a hin would be, I guess, three logs, right? Three logs, which would be 12 revi'its. Okay. So that's it. Lekeves ha'echad, for one lamb. You should know that all these animals that were sacrificed had specific amounts of libations that were allotted to them, that they'd be accompanied by a meal offering mixed with oil and the wine. So again, if you think about the combination, there's some symbolism in the fact that the flour represents in some ways the flour from which human beings were created, okay, in metaphorically in that chapter in Genesis, right? Wine is a sign of joy. Joy, it's a symbol of joy. That's why we make Kiddush of a wine on Shabbat, to symbolize the joy we have in celebrating the Shabbat. Oil has to do perhaps with greatness, right? The idea of anointing someone, having a specific, and that usually is a process by which their status is raised in some way or another. That's one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is that it's like a meal, right? It's like and that the mizbeach, the altar, is a table, and that in a sense we are participating in a meal with God. So anyway, there is Rashi on this. So isaron selot, 1/10 part, I believe, of fine flour. So he says it's asirit ha'efa. So I only gave you liquid measurements there. I did not give you solid measurements there, but it's 1/10 of an ephah, and 1/10 of an ephah is an equivalent to 43 eggs. That's the volume of an egg, the chomesh beitzah, and 1/5 of an egg. I realize, so that's quite large, right? Quite a large amount of in terms of volume. Beshemen katit, here we go. In oil that has been pounded, right? Lo lechova ne'emar. So Rashi says this does not come as an obligation. And this idea of chovah and chiyuv is a very fundamental concept in terms of traditional Judaism. The idea of obligation, right, is as that we have as human beings in terms of satisfying the reason why we are created. And so, in terms of mitzvot, they, for the most part, they involve something called a chiyuv, and the rabbis and through the Talmud and the oral law determine what are the requirements involved in fulfilling the commandment. So he's saying here, this idea of bringing this very, very pure oil is not an obligation. So he's going to explain this to you because it sounds like an obligation. Lo chiyuv ne'emar katit. So this term katit is not said to mean as an obligation. Ella, however, lahachshir. But what it's saying is that if you want to use this kind of oil with the mincha, with the flour, you can. That you're allowed to do it. It's permission. It's there to indicate permission. And he's going to explain this further. Why are we understanding this way? Lefi, because shene'emar katit lamaor. Later on, when it talks about the oil that they used to burn in the menorah, that had to be katit. In other words, the ma'or means for illumination. So the oil that they used in the menorah had to be the purest olive oil, and clearly in the fact that it lacked impurities or any sediment meant that it would burn as cleanly as possible. And there it is an obligation. Umashma lema'or. And because it says katit lema'or, right? It says it should be katit for illumination. Umashma, that would imply the ma'or, that strictly for illumination it has to be katit, velo lemenachot, but not the oil used for meal offerings. So if it didn't say katit here, we would think that you are not allowed to use katit oil for menachot, for meal offerings. Yachol lefaslo lemenachot. In other words, it is pasul for menachot. That's exactly what this means. Pasul means it's invalid. Such oil would be invalid for meal offerings. Talmud Lomar. For that reason, Scripture says kan here in this verse, katit. It says the word katit. V'lo ne'emar katit lamaor, right? Ella. And when it said katit lamaor, that it should be katit only for illumination, ella lema'et menachot, okay? So, v'lo ne'emar katit lamaor, ella lema'et menachot. So what that katit lamaor is coming to tell us is that it excludes the sole use of katit for menachot, for meal offerings.
Rabbi,
Yeah, can I just finish this?
sure.
She'ein sarich katit, that you do not have to use this pure level of oil. Lo tzarich katit she'af hanoten hatachun bereichaim. That is to say that even olives that were ground in a mill, that is to extract the oil, kasher bahem, is kasher for menachot, for meal offerings. Yes, please.
Yeah. At our last session, I raised the question as you're going through the this looks like a very complex concepts, uh, uh, and it's and I wonder if the audience for this kind of teaching was this is sort of graduate school level, and
Yes.
uh, what beyond simply the those sorts of concepts that you've described just now, again, which is a number of multiplications in order to get the concept, and so forth. These I imagine are more than simple folk who is the audience, and is there a broader application that has to do with everyday life of I imagine people who are basically had a small farm and maybe a few animals, and so forth. And if so, uh, if so, how would you go beyond the what you just said in order to relate it to parts of their life so that they got they got a broader lesson?
Right. Okay. So that's certainly a challenge. This little piece that we had is an example of halachic midrash. In other words, what this is trying to do is explain the way in which the Torah is interpreted to be as accurate as possible. So sometimes it involves going over such a thing more than once, which is perhaps one of the reasons it's called Mishnah, from a word shana, and that very often you discover that when you go over something more than once, you discover levels of understanding and meaning that you don't to begin with. And of course, you're dependent on whatever skills I have or skills I lack in trying to explain this to you. Rashi, I believe that Rashi's initial, perhaps one of his motivations for doing what he did is that he was concerned about missionaries coming and giving explanations and interpretations of the Torah that might lead people away from Judaism. This is what we just did is very similar to the kinds of logic that are used in the Talmud. But the ability to think rationally is a very high gift that we would consider on the part of the divine. So the way to understand these things and to realize that meaning has so much to do with context, and in comparing one context to another context, that's what we're doing here, right? We're comparing the context of this word katit when it comes to meal offerings, as opposed to katit when it came to the oil used in the menorah, and where it said specifically, it could have just said olive oil, period. But the reason when it says that uses the word lamaor for illumination, and this here is not about illumination. Thinking this through very carefully is also, I think, part of the discipline and the practice of Judaism. Bart.
My question, Rashi, where did he live? In Europe somewhere?
He lived in France, essentially. I believe, I'm trying to
Yeah,
think.
that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
Because wouldn't you have to have fresh olives to create the first squeeze, if you would?
Well, you have to have right. I think you have to have, yeah, I mean, you do. You have to have developed olives, correct? And of course, there are all kinds of olives, and there's some that are better from oil, etc. But
I'm
yeah,
just wondering whether it was possible for people in Rashi's time and era to get that freshly squeezed EVOO, if you'll allow me to.
well, when they talk about extra virgin olive oil, I
Right.
believe those terms are used in regards to the amount of pressing that the olives have gone through. So please understand, of course, that the actual practice of what we're reading right now, could not take place anywhere except by the time we're looking at Rashi for sure, would have been in the temple. In other words, once King Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, no other place was actually considered appropriate. There was a time, this gets us into a whole other subject, because at one time there were actually what were called high places spread throughout the land of Israel where offerings were brought. And once the temple was built, meant that those high places were no longer valid. It took a long time, as we read in the book of Kings especially, for them to rid people of the practice of using these high places to bring offerings. So again, what we're reading right now has 2 points to it. One, and Larry, in some ways, I hope this answers your question, right? In some ways, it is giving us the information that despite the fact that the temple doesn't exist, and these people, I think, would have had a recognition and a realization of how important the temple really was in terms of its spiritual values, something that is missing to a great extent in the education of our children, let's say in the liberal areas of Judaism. Okay. So they would have known that. The other is that there's always this hope that the temple would be rebuilt. Why? Essentially, and there's more than one reason here, that the temple represented a nexus point between the divine and the world, and all that actually involves. So when you read the Aleinu prayer in our prayer book, and you read Aleinu, and you read it through carefully and think carefully about what it's talking about a time when the world and humanity can live in the recognition that we are all here ultimately to serve our Creator by doing acts of kindness and compassion and justice, etc. And that the world could. So there's this vision of a world in which justice and righteousness and compassion, etc., and kindness basically pervade the consciousness of every single human being. And to keep this alive, especially if you think about the time when Jews were persecuted by the authorities, where they were looked down as second-class citizens in the countries where they lived, studying this material gives one a sense of worthiness. And very, I think, and look how we survived, despite the number of years it's been since the temple even existed. Larry, do you feel that I'm at least touching on what you're seeking here?
Yes, yes, of course. And but what you just said also, not but
Yeah.
in addition,
Yeah.
uh, 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 do the temples of today,
Hmm.
do they take on the that that presence also? Because if they do, I'm not sure it's clear to everyone who gathers together that this is this is in place of place of the holy the
Right.
temple in Jerusalem.
Okay, so I'm going to have to bring this session to a close rather quickly. But having said that, I would say that it doesn't replace, it complements. And this has to do with the whole idea of how the prayer book and how the prayer service developed. Because there's a sense that it actually began already in terms of those communities that were distant from the temple and wanted to have a connection to what was going on in the temple. And that's about all I can say right this second. And perhaps we can continue this on next time we meet. And I'll mention this. There have been other times when I've mentioned this in the course of these studies, but I'm happy to discuss it again, and give you some background there. So with that, I'm going to have to stop the recording.